大家好，我是郑博文律师。
Civil rights advocate, former UC Regents, board of directors, and businessman. This is who I have today, Ward Connerly. I'm so excited to have Ward today come and speak about something that is very critical in the state of California, and that is Proposition 16. Ward, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, Ward, you are known for being one of the architects of Proposition 209, and yet somehow you have decided to wade into the battle for Proposition 16. Can you tell me why?
Well, I don't think that I'm wading into it. I was already in it from the day that 209 passed. The legislature of California, which is controlled by a particular ethnic majority in California, wants to get rid of Proposition 209. And I believe that that would be a serious mistake for California, for America, and for all of us who believe in the principle of treating everybody equally. This Proposition 16 will visit harm upon students, especially students of Chinese descent, because they are very, very competitive when it comes to being admitted to the University of California campuses at Berkeley, Los Angeles, and San Diego, three of the most selective public universities in the world. And the university is caught in a tough spot. It wants to increase the number of Black and Latino students, but it's hard to do that when you're looking at scholastic achievement and you find that Black and Latino students are not doing as well as Asians, what we call Asians in this country, or whites. Now, over the last few years, the university has succeeded in achieving this so-called diversity. They've done so largely by reducing the number of whites. But now they're at the point where, in order to get that and maintain that level of racial mixture, they're going to have to cut back on the number of Asians that are admitted. I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong to hold people to different standards based on their skin color or race, whatever that means, or their ethnic background, or the country from whence their ancestors came.
Well, before we go into just different standards, I previously said that you were part of the civil rights movement. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, who you are, and your fight for civil rights?
Sure. I was born in Leesville, Louisiana in 1939, so I'm an old guy. And my parents divorced when I was 2 years old. I was born in 1939, as I said. My mother died when I was 4. I lived with a grandmother and my Aunt Bert, my mother's sister, and her husband, Uncle James. I moved to California, and it was in 1962 that I graduated from college. I started my career in public service as a civil servant, working with the California legislature. I went into business for myself in 1973. My friend, who was the governor of California, Pete Wilson, appointed me to the Board of Regents in 1993, and the University of California has 10 campuses. 3 of them are the more select ones, and a lot of students that value education would love to go to the University of California at Berkeley. But in our state, those who are of Asian descent place a greater value, I believe, on education and thus on the University of California as an institution. They compete very hard, work very hard for it. And in my view, if the university didn't have to abide by 209, the policy that the voters approved in 1996, a substantial number of Americans of Chinese descent would not be going to the University of California at Berkeley.
Well, you raise an interesting point in that Proposition 209 was passed in 1996. It was really passed because you were the architect of it. Was it because you were at the UC Regents as an overseer of all the UCs? Is that how you decided to present 209 to the state of California?
Well, I was on the Board of Regents. I was appointed, as I said, in 1993. I was a very active regent, spent about 30 to 35 hours a week. This is volunteer work, by the way. Regents don't get paid. So I spent 30 to 35 hours a week studying what was going on. I visited every one of the campuses. There were 9 at that time. I talked to a lot of professors, a lot of students. I maintained my contacts in the Rotary Club of Sacramento. I think that as citizens, regents have to do that to stay connected. And after the first year, I sort of become one of the de facto leaders, if you will, on the Board of Regents. As I studied the admissions policies, in fact, my first assignment was to be chairman of the committee that oversaw the policies for admission. And it occurred to me that every legal document that the university has the words, "The university does not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, color, and all of those factors." But as I attended the meetings, the university continually talked about diversity, celebrating our diversity. And so I began to put 2 and 2 together, and I came to the conclusion that we were in fact discriminating. We had different standards for admission. One case at Berkeley, we had a matrix that was called the Karabel, Karabel matrix, that allocated points to applicants on the basis of their race. And if you were an Asian, you had to get a lot more points than anybody else to be admitted, a considerable number. Now, they said that, well, we really don't use that as a hard and fast rule. It is only a rule of thumb. But Paul, I'll tell you, as I looked into all of this, the conclusion I reached was that we are discriminating. And we happen to have in this nation a policy called affirmative action. The big lie about affirmative action is that when you admit someone with race as one of many factors, you're not discriminating. You're just using affirmative action. And to me, it became a word game. It's not a word game if you're on the receiving end of this. and you happen to be a young immigrant student or an American student who happens to be of Chinese descent or Indian descent, and the university doesn't admit you, despite the fact that you have the highest academic standards, 4.2, lots of advanced placement students, but you're turned down. And you're turned down because some other student who has a 2.8 or a 3.0, but who happens to be black, is admitted. I concluded that's wrong. It's not fair. It cheats the system. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. So at that point, for the first time in my life, I became energized sufficiently to take this system on and to eliminate it, which I did at the University of California. That was in 1995 that the regents voted on it. Then a year plus later, the people of California decided to get involved in this because I had led the way in passing around petitions, and we ratified what the regents had done. But there was I went there with no predisposed belief one way or the other. In fact, I had no knowledge of what was going on at the University of California. I didn't go to UC. I went to a community college, American River, graduated, and then went to Sac State. So I didn't have the luxury of going to the University of California, but I did live under conditions that were discriminatory in the Deep South. And I've learned with every fiber of my being that it is wrong to discriminate against people and to use their identity as a basis for applying different standards to them.
But people that are supporting Proposition 16 are saying that if you don't support Proposition 16, you are actually racist. You do not want diversity in the state of California. Do you have a response to that?
I can assure you that those on my side say the same thing. They say that you're racist by using race. Those on the other side, the yes people, say you're racist by not using race. What are you going to believe, But words matter. And the reality is that those who want to use affirmative action are playing a big game. They're hoodwinking the people of this state into thinking that with words you can erase the blackboard and take away what is really an evil thing, and that's to use different standards to be applied to people on the basis of their race or their ethnic background or national origin. We have laws against that. We've had them for a long time. That's what the civil rights movement was about. And those who support Prop 16 will tell you about inequities and systemic racism. Man, it's systemic racism when you start using affirmative action as a basis for discriminating against people. And that's what's happening.
Well, you talked about facing discrimination in the Deep South. Can you be able to explain that, what you mean by that?
When I was born in 1939, my birth certificate had a C on it. That C was not for Connerly. It wasn't for the ward of the hospital that I would be in. That C meant I was colored. It was put there because the society at that point categorized people into white and colored. And if you were colored, there were certain schools that you had to attend. The society was totally segregated. We were considered, as colored people, we were considered 3/5 of a person. Our country had been in a bitter battle about race, and the conclusion had been reached that we should be granted total freedom Martin Luther King led the effort to ensure that we would get total freedom. Total freedom meant being treated equally to whites. And so it wasn't until the early 1960s that C, that colored, should no longer be the basis for treating me differently than anybody else. As a colored person in the Deep South, there are certain restaurants my family could not attend. We could not go knock on a door and say, "May we rent your house?" That was not permitted. And so I grew up in that environment. My family was a mixed family. We had Irish, we had people of French descent, we had African descent, all of those except Asian, I guess, were part of my existence, my immediate family. And so for me, this business of putting people into different racial groups is just basically wrong. When I fill out the census, I put down declined estate because I have that mixture. I'm probably more Choctaw Native American than anything, but I would like to see our country treat all of its citizens as equals. You are no different than I am. Our ancestors are different, but we both have 2 legs, 2 arms. Our blood is red. You have hair, I don't. But you and I are basically 2 human beings. Why should we have different rights? Why should the government apply one set of standards to your kids, if you have them, and a different set of standards to my grandkids? Shouldn't do it, Paul. They shouldn't do that. And yet we're so obsessed with race. We think that we're doing the Lord's work when we move people around like they're checkers on a checkers board. But we are harming innocent people when we use race as the basis for their pursuit of happiness.
Well, you've referred to Martin Luther King, and that seems to be the rallying cry for people that are in support of Proposition 16. The belief is that there's an extension of the King dynasty as well as Martin Luther King's view of life. In fact, it's my understanding that one of Martin Luther King's children is actually a strong supporter of Proposition 16. So how does that connect with the civil rights movement? I'm just a little bit confused. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. The whole issue of race is embedded with the misuse of words. Look up the term someday, affirmative action. It sounds so sweet. It sounds so benign. But behind that those sweet sounding 2 words is granted the ability for the government to discriminate. So how on the one hand do we say we're going to treat everybody as equals and then discriminate against them? It's because we employ these words to mean things that the ordinary use of those words would not tolerate. Dr. King was a leader of civil rights. My opponents say that I'm not entitled to use the term civil rights because they think civil rights, that they have a monopoly on that. Civil rights are freedom of speech, equal treatment under the law, equal justice. Those are civil rights. And I and the thousands of volunteers who are alongside me in this fight to preserve 209, we have civil rights too, and we're entitled to use them. We're entitled to use the words of Dr. King when he talked about his dream of the day when skin color would no longer be relevant, that his kids would be judged by who they were. That's what it means about content of care. character rather than skin color. I don't care if, personally, if Dr. King came back in the flesh himself. He doesn't dictate how I believe or what the Constitution says. Our Constitution does not acknowledge even races, except in the 14th Amendment. It provides equal justice under the law. And Abraham Lincoln said those immortal words that we are a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That doesn't mean that everybody is equal in stature or equal in weight or equal in strength or equal in anything, except we're equal in citizenship. We are the same in terms of citizenship. Affirmative action departs from that. When Lyndon Johnson created affirmative action in 1965, he said, you don't take a man who has been hobbled by chains, bring him to the starting line of a race, and tell him to run the race and think that you have been just and fair. That was in 1965. And so affirmative action was created as a way to bring people like me who had been locked out of American life into the mainstream of American life. And it acknowledged that you would be applying different standards. Interestingly enough, however, in 1961, then President John F. Kennedy had also issued an executive order which defined affirmative action as non-discrimination, nothing about taking active steps to do anything, but it was non-discrimination, and here are the operative words: regardless or without regard to race. So you had these competing visions, these competing versions of what American life was going to be like. It was like one was saying, namely Kennedy, in order for the Negro, which is what we were called then, to be brought into American life, there will be no discrimination against them. Kennedy dies, assassination. 4 years later, we have a different president. He was being lobbied by Dr. King to do more than just having a non-discrimination clause. So he issues an executive order that says, I want to see the results. This is what was being said to contractors and others who were doing business with the federal government. I want to see results, he said. And we embarked upon this journey of affirmative action, thinking that it would be temporary. In 2003, the Supreme Court sanctioned the use of race, which it had been narrowing all the time. It sanctioned it with Sandra Day O'Connor handing down the deciding judgment. And she said that she thought that the day would come in 25 years, which would be 2028, when this would no longer be necessary. So affirmative action altered. I don't know if you're still there, Paul.
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, well,
Absolutely.
Couldn't see you on my screen. It's changed.
Yeah.
But we've been marching down this path for years now, 55 years, in which we've had this mindset that Black people still need this hand up in order to be active citizens of our society. It's time to move on. Time to move on, because now we're doing a lot of harm to a lot of people. And while Black people like me, have made our way into American life, we're not as competitive at the University of California in the quantities that some people think necessary. But that's because a lot of black kids are going to historically black colleges and universities. They're getting scholarships from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and other places, so that their numbers are scattered around. And that's a matter of choice for them. They don't, and I hate to say it this way, but black people, our culture is such that we don't place as much emphasis on it as families of Chinese American descent. That's a matter of culture. And so our numbers are down. But it's by choice to a large extent. It's not that we're born less smart, it's culture. And I don't know what the answer is, but I know that it's wrong when we depart from our standard of equality. That's wrong. And we have to have a moral judgment about these things. And my sense of morality is treat everybody equally. The Constitution requires it. Common sense, I think, requires it.
Well, you also referred to harm, specifically harm, that affirmative action has actually harmed people, but haven't people been able to stand up and say that affirmative action has specifically helped some individuals be able to achieve their dreams, and without affirmative action, they could not have become pillars of society? People have talked about that. Doesn't that kind of fly in the face of the position that's being presented right now?
No, it does not. There are a lot of people who would like to be in a different place than they would like. If I didn't get to go to UC Berkeley, I still could go to UC Riverside if there had been one. I could still go to Sacramento State University or Cal State at Sacramento. I could still apply for and be admitted to American River Community College and transfer into university campus later on. But they shouldn't turn some kid who is of Chinese descent away, who might have better academic credentials than I, so that I can go to UC. Nobody's denied an education in the state of California. Nobody. We have 100 community colleges, one within probably 15 minutes driving time of every man, woman, and child in this state. So this isn't about who gets an education. If you want one, damn it, you can get it. It's about who gets to go to Berkeley and UCLA and UC San Diego. And given the dynamics of academic credentials, Black kids and Latino kids have not been as competitive as Asian kids and white kids. I hate to talk about things in racial terms. I don't like checking these stupid little race boxes, but I can't be coward about using these terms, so much so that I fail to characterize the reality of what's going on.
It's definitely a very tough topic, just because both sides have essentially said that it's racial, if you don't support it. One of the concerns that people have had is the way the ballot proposition summary has been written. And the ballot proposition, essentially, when it goes out to print, speaks of diversity, but yet Proposition 16 doesn't reference diversity. So can you be able to reconcile that? Because I think that there's a lot of confusion between voters that actually want to know what Proposition 16 is about, because the ballot proposition itself, based upon the summary that's being given to the voters, says diversity. Can you be able to explain this inherent conflict that's being seen between the actual proposition? What is the proposition itself, and the ballot summary that's being sent out to voters?
Herein lies pollution, rhetorical pollution in the way that the ballot is constructed. The Attorney General has an obligation to precisely and accurately define what different ballot propositions happen to be. When the legislature took up ACA 5, which was the measure that allowed Proposition 16 to be on the ballot, the title of ACA 5 was Government Preferences. Nowhere in the language of Proposition 209 is there any mention of the word diversity. It was not a burning issue in 1996 when 209 was crafted. It is not contained, that word is not contained in the Proposition 209 text. What Proposition 209 says, precisely the words, quote, the state, and that's a small s, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. End of quote. Paul, that's 37 words, no hidden agenda. It's saying if you discriminate against somebody by giving them a preference over somebody else in those three areas, based on those 5 factors, you're violating the Constitution. Now, the Attorney General has written a ballot title, which is his responsibility, that betrays common sense, common understanding of language. Diversity polls better for those who want Prop 16 than it does for those of us who want to stay with the language placed into the Constitution by Proposition 209. Diversity holds better. If they had their preference, they would probably title it Allow Affirmative Action, which the courts have already ruled is a, quote, an amorphous term. It means anything you want it to mean. If you want to advertise a job in a certain community, black neighborhood, fine. That's affirmative action. We have no problem with that. If you want to engage in outreach, it's okay too, as long as you don't do it at the exclusion of any one group. But when you want to apply different standards in the name of affirmative action, you're giving somebody a preference. That is preferential treatment. That's what we seek to forbid.
Well, there are a lot of people in support of Proposition 16 that say, and I remember I read the ballot proposition, the title, all the summaries. One of the arguments is that for every dollar, 80 cents, and I believe it says 80 cents goes to old white men. That was one of the arguments, and they actually put it. It's literally right there. The argument for Proposition 16 in support of it would be, well, if you look at the studies, really people of color as well as females aren't able to achieve enough satisfaction or enough money to actually be equal, and therefore we need to use preferential treatment for race and gender to balance society out. What's your response to
Equal
that?
outcomes. They want equal outcomes. That's what they want. They want equal outcomes. And I would agree. The outcome is not equal. But if you're looking at a basketball game, the guy who is 7 feet tall is probably going to score more points than the guy who is 5'8". Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, should we then lower the basket? Should we do things that will make it possible for the 5'8" guy to be more competitive with the 7-foot guy? All the teams that I've seen have a disproportionate number of black people on it. Basketball team, football team, black people dominate. Now, if we do those things, they cease to be basketball, cease to be a football game. We have to rely on merit. And it becomes even more insidious if we start applying different rules, different standards to college admission, to hiring people. Because if you're not using race as a factor, and it just so happens that somebody who is winning that competition is white and a male, are we just going to wipe away all the standards, all the structure of the game, all the competition after the game is played and say you didn't win, but here's 20 points extra so that you can have the same outcome as somebody else? I think that the answer is to say to those who are competing, you're just going to have to work harder. You're going to have to become more competitive. They use this 80 cents on the dollar stuff for wages, for example, of women. There are a lot of women who make the choice that they will stay home, raise the family, or they will go into a different line of work than males. Now that has changed, and more women are going into science and engineering, technology, and you will see that margin shrinking because there are factors that account for it that the proponents of 16 are not sharing with people. But there is no, in my belief, there is no discrimination against women, against black people, against Latinos in this state. If there is, let's specifically identify it and deal with it, but not throw out the standards, throw out the commitment to equal treatment that we have to realize these equal outcomes. This is about more, in my view, than Proposition 16.
Okay.
It's really about the role that Americans of Asian descent are going to play in American life. It does not escape me, and it has not for a long time, that when you look at television and you see the programming, it's not as often that you will see a person of Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese descent. It's not often. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the newsroom, as the weather person, maybe. You don't see them in politics that much. Andrew Yang, I think that was his name, was a guy that, were I a Democrat, which I would never be now, I would have voted for him. I would have walked on hot coals for him, because he was the only one that brought some fresh thinking to the political process. But when Biden selects his running mate, who did he select? Selected a black woman who had been very critical of him, in fact. People of Chinese descent, Yang, for example, I'll bet you there wasn't a thought given to him, or Buttigieg for that matter, or Elizabeth Warren. And when I was a regent, one of the UC administrators justified holistic review, recognizing that it would probably have an adverse effect on students of Asian descent, because Asian students are so dull. Those were the words he used, Paul, I swear to you. So this is about more than jobs and employment and contracting. It's about the role that some people who have been marginalized, to some extent by their choice. When I was on the Board of Regents, David Lee, an entrepreneur, an investor of dollars, he was my closest ally. And when I started getting involved in this issue in 1994, we talked about it. And he said words that I still remember. It's not our culture, Ward, to get involved like this. He supported me when the regents voted. He counseled me on the sidelines at various times, but he didn't get actively involved. And when I asked why, he said it wasn't their culture. And I said to him, you let them beat the crap out of me, but it's not your culture to rise in defense of students who are being discriminated against at Berkeley. Now that is all beginning to change. It was Linda Yang who provided the leadership with sideline help from me to overturn the action of the Washington legislature when it passed I-1000. Americans of Chinese descent led the way. Now it's Americans of Chinese descent who are leading the way to defend Prop 209. But we need to understand that there is a level of civic engagement that is mushrooming, and it's for the good of the country that this happens. People are more defensive, more supportive when groups of people come forward to defend themselves, rather than having some 81-year-old brown-skinned guy out there saying things that don't really affect him anymore.
Well, some people have said that the view of 209, that maybe at a point in time in 1996, it was a good move. The UC regents had supported it in 1995, and then it was codified in our state constitution in 96. But 2020, that no longer applies. That attitude no longer applies, and that 209 really is, it should be sunsetted because it's not applicable to 2020. Do you have a response to that?
Well, we are a free people in this country. Constitution provides that. Now that we're free, let's get rid of the Constitution. Now that we have our liberty, let's get rid of the Constitution. Now that we have more equality, let's get rid of the laws that require equality. I think they're being disingenuous when they say that. They're being terribly disingenuous. On the one hand, they're saying well, maybe we already have all this equality and we don't need that language anymore. In the next breath, they say, but the outcome is not what it should be. We have too much inequity, too many disparities. You can't have it both ways. You can't argue both things at the same time and not be a hypocrite.
Well, you referred to the state of Washington in this I-1000. Can you explain what happened in the state of Washington? Was it the same fight as the fight here in California? Did they defeat it? How was it done?
I-1000 was placed on the ballot by a black guy named Jesse Wineberry. Jesse Wineberry was one who was benefiting from contracting. A white prime contractor is going to design a freeway, let's say, and he is required to not contract with a black firm when he gets the contract. When I-200 passed in Washington State, which I was a leader of, in 1998, the language was identical to Prop 209. But for years, they had tried to overturn I-200. So they convinced the legislature to put I-1000 on the ballot, and I-1000 repeal by amendment, repealed I-200. When it passed, literally in the last 2 hours of the legislative session, despite the fact that people from Microsoft and other technology places had opposed it, legislature passed it. Linda Yang, who was an entrepreneur, contacted me because I was living in Idaho at the time, next door to Washington. And I joined forces with them, and signatures were gathered to put a referendum on the ballot, R88, referendum 88, and the voters overturned the legislature. It was narrow, but in 34 out of 39 counties, the voters voted for R88, which negated the action of the Washington legislature in approving I-1000. The reason that the margin was as close as it was because of Seattle, the vote in Seattle and King County. So this is sort of like a precursor to ACA 5 and Prop 16. Same demographics and same issues involved, same language, probably the same motivation. It's not black people who are yelling out for greater admission to UC. It's contracting.
Can you be able to explain that? Because Proposition 16 is being pushed as diversity for purposes of education, but yet our conversation now has gone into government contracting. Can you be able to explain that? Because I don't think people quite understand how Proposition 16 has anything to do with contracting and the people behind Proposition 16 wanting to get more contracts.
Prior to Proposition 209, there was a set of policies at the state government which required prime contractors to allocate, I believe it was 15% of their contracts to a minority-owned business, and I think it was 5%, or maybe it was 5 women and 10 minority. But anyway, it was about 15% of your contract. If you were a prime contractor, you would allocate 15% of that contract to minority-owned business and women-owned businesses, known as the Maybe Weeby program. When 209 passed and I-200 passed, that was ended because the prime contractors, in many cases, had relationships with firms that they ordinarily wouldn't do business with, because the firms were not, most of them, were not even in that line of work. And they would have responsibility, however, for the work that was being done by these Maybe Weeby firms. And so there was a lot of money that the Maybe Weeby firms were getting that they no longer are getting because the source of that money dried up. What they should have been doing is bidding on their own. Bid on their own. If they weren't getting it, and if the policy makers, the city councils, and the boards of supervisors wanted to be concerned about diversity, they could always say, well, we don't require the low bid. We will do whatever it is required to ensure that Maybe Weeby firms get dollars, and many of them did. They started having small business preferences, which are acceptable. But those who are pushing for this, when Shirley Weber made her circuit tour preparatory to this bill going, or ACA 5 passing, she was counseled by a lot of minority contractors who were urging her to do what she did. This wasn't because of kids getting admitted to UC. It's because of the dollars that were no longer going to the Maybe Weeby firms. And I think most taxpayers would say, go with low bid. Don't worry about race.
Well, in terms of what we had discussed before, it seems like the UC Regents, correct me if I'm wrong, that the UC Regents, although in 1995 they eliminated preferential treatment, in 1996 the residents in the state of California eliminated preferential treatment based on race and gender. Have the UC Regents had a turnaround? Are they now supporting Proposition 16?
They had a close to a turnaround after after the state of California passed Proposition, or passed 209. And I voted with them. The argument was made, whether it was real or not, but one of my colleagues on the board said, Ward, the voters have now said this is the way they want to go. You won that victory, but we're still in the eye of the hurricane here by the fact that we led the way on that. Would you go along with removing SP1 and SP2 from the books? And I went along with it. I said, okay, if the university is getting a lot of heat, a lot of criticism for something that the people of California have put into their constitution, and we are governed by the Constitution, I'll go along with that. So I voted in favor of rescinding SP1 and SP2.
And the SP1 and SP2, in terms of rescinding it, what was the SP1 and SP2?
SP1 said that the university would not use race and sex in the admissions process. SP2 said that the university would not do that in contracting. The university, prior to SP2, gave preferences to firms that were minority owned, and the work to be done was under $50,000 per contract. The university could just admit a firm on a sole source basis with no competition. SP2 ended that.
Understood. It's still very, difficult for an average voter, because obviously this year there's a lot of race issues, a lot of things have been brought up, and it is very difficult for a person to be able to decide whether to vote in favor of or against Proposition 16. There's confusion all around. How can a voter be able to understand Proposition 16 in a nutshell? Because both sides have these great arguments.
Read the ballot. Read the ballot. The other side, I am sure, is hoping and praying that the decision about president will be so compelling that people will flock to the polls, vote for Joe Biden, and be advised by the Democrat Party to vote a straight party line. And the party line will be yes on Prop 16, yes on Biden, yes on a lot of other stuff. If they read 209, though, if they read the language about Prop 16, actually read it rather than relying on the ballot title, which is allow diversity, which is specious, then they will vote against Prop 16. I have no doubt about that. Even though the demographics have changed somewhat, I think people will conclude, as I have, we don't want a state that has empowered has empowered the state government, every city and county, every university, every college, every government agency, the mosquito abatement district, to discriminate against people on the basis of color, race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin. That's not what an enlightened society would do. The reality of California has caught up with 209. If 209 was early or okay, although the people that are making that argument about, geez, it might have been okay then, they didn't vote for it. I'll bet you they didn't vote for it. Because they're not concerned about equal rights. They're concerned about the rights of Black people. They want more Latinos in those positions of government because they think that the demographics have changed. We're a majority minority. People of color are now the majority, they would argue, and therefore we need to make a change. I say I don't care who's in the majority or who's in the minority. Every person should be treated equally.
So what is your path to victory? There is there's a lot of money that has been raised by supporters of Proposition 16. It seems to be, David and Goliath type of battle. What is your path to victory?
Well, you're right. It is David and Goliath because largely two billionaires, one of whom is Reed Hastings of Netflix, and the other is a wealthy real estate developer from Oakland who was given $1.5 million to match and exceed Reed Hastings' $1 million. Therein lies the difference between them having a lot of money and are scratching for money. We have thousands of donors. They have less than 100. And there is a story there too. But we're just going to put the message out about what it is. The language is very clear. 37 words. You want to live in that kind of California? Or do you want to live in a California where about 1,000 government entities are empowered to discriminate? It's hard to even imagine this. If you told me this would be the paradigm in the 1960s, that someday we will reach the point where we want to discriminate, I would have thought you're crazy. Paul, you're out of your mind. But yet here we are.
Well, just one last question. Why is Proposition 16 not a repeal and replace? In terms of the California Constitution, if they find it unsatisfactory, why does the proposition merely eliminate language but not amend the language to make it more protective? Do you happen to know why?
I don't know. That was their decision. Our legislature, in its infinite wisdom, made this decision. It might have been more palatable had they come up with a rational approach to this. They may not have engendered as much opposition. But they didn't do that. They were just going to try to shove it down the throats of the people of California. No nuances. You and I are talking about some of the nuances of all of this. There were no nuances discussed by the legislature. Just an outright repeal of 209. You're not required to do it that way. They could have crafted something that would be more palatable. They didn't do that. And so what they've done, though, is to say that government, in the interest of diversity, which is undefined, the government will be able to create institutions, government institutions, that reflect, quote, reflect the racial and ethnic population of California. No quotas, mind you. No quotas. Just a bunch of lies and horse manure.
Well, just within the last minute, do you have any last remarks as it relates to people that are looking into Proposition 16? Any final thoughts at all?
My final thought is that you do your due diligence. There's never been a time in our country, and certainly not in my 81 years, when it is more incumbent upon voters to actually read. Take an hour of your time and invest it in reading what it is that you're voting on. Sit back with a nice cold one and reflect on the times in which we live. We are essentially starting this society over. We're going to have to rebuild our economy. We're going to have to do a lot of things all over again to create society. And ask yourself, what should be the rules of the game? How do we want people to interact with each other? What's our responsibility in government? Are we referees? Or are we the ones who are responsible for moving these parts on the checkerboard around?
Well, I wanted to thank Mr. Connerly, Ward Connerly, for his time today. I'm just so appreciative. Ward Connerly, again, is the architect of Proposition 209. as well as the leader of the opposition to Proposition 16 that will be voted on by the voters on November 3rd, 2020. Just a friendly reminder that the ballots will be coming out, the vote by mail ballots will be coming out in early October, and the sample ballot, which is the booklet, which has a summary of the proposition, will also be coming out around that time. Again, we encourage every voter to be informed. Again, thank you, Ward, for coming, and good luck.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day. I'm going to
You
disconnect.
too.
Thank you. All right.